I should have seen the truth the first night my husband introduced me to his friends. But I never imagined he was offering me to them. Not in the way you might think. Not physically. At least not at first. What Jake did was worse. He offered me psychologically. He turned me into entertainment, into currency, into proof of his status. And when I finally understood what he'd done, I made sure everyone else understood it too. My name is Sarah. I'm 30-1 years old. I have a master's degree in marketing, I run marathons, and I thought I had built a good life with a man I loved. 6 months after everything fell apart, I still catch myself questioning my own memory. But I have the evidence, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. Jake and I had been married for 2 years when he started talking about his college friends more frequently. We'd been together for 5 years total, married for 2, and I thought I knew everything about him. We met at a conference in Chicago. He worked in finance, I worked in corporate marketing. He was charming, ambitious, and attentive in ways that made me feel like the most important person in any room. He remembered small details about my day, brought me coffee exactly how I liked it, and never made me feel like my career mattered less than his. Looking back, I realized the attention wasn't love. It was reconnaissance. The friends became a fixture in our conversations around month 3 of our second year of marriage. Mark, who apparently ran a successful tech startup. David, a lawyer who handled commercial real estate. Ryan, who worked in private equity. And Connor, who did something vague in consulting that Jake always described with an admiring tone. They'd all gone to the same university, stayed close, and according to Jake, they were finally in a place where they could reconnect properly. I really want you to meet them, Jake said one Thursday evening while we were making dinner. I was chopping vegetables for a stir-fry, and he was leaning against the counter with a glass of wine, watching me with that expression I'd learned meant he wanted something. And I want them to see how incredible you are. The phrasing should have bothered me. Not I want you to know them, but I want them to see you. Like I was something to be displayed. But I was flattered. Jake had always been somewhat private about his past, and I interpreted this as him opening up, letting me into a part of his life he'd kept separate. I thought it meant our marriage was deepening. Of course, I said, smiling at him over my shoulder. When were you thinking? Next Saturday. We could do dinner at that Italian place downtown, the one with the private rooms. I agreed without hesitation. I was actually excited. I wanted to meet the people who'd known Jake before I had, wanted to understand the full picture of the man I'd married. I spent the week planning my outfit. A navy dress that was elegant but not trying too hard, professional but approachable. I wanted to make a good impression. I wanted them to like me. That Saturday, Jake seemed unusually energized. He kept checking his watch during the drive downtown, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. I attributed it to normal nervousness about mixing friend groups and partners. I squeezed his hand. It's going to be fine. I told him, I'm sure they're great. They are, he said. But he didn't look at me. He was smiling at something ahead, something I couldn't see yet. The restaurant was upscale, dimly lit with that calculated ambience that made everyone look slightly more attractive than they were in daylight. We were led to a private room in the back where 4 men were already seated, drinks in hand, laughing about something I'd missed. They all looked up when we entered, and I felt their eyes move across me in a way that made my skin prickle. Not threatening exactly, assessing. "Gentlemen," Jake said, and his voice had changed. It was louder, more performative. "This is Sarah." They stood, and for the next few minutes, I was absorbed in handshakes and greetings and the careful social choreography of first meetings. Mark was tall and lean with wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual air. with the kind of confident handshake that lawyers perfect. Ryan had slicked minus back hair and an expensive watch that caught the light. Connor was the most conventionally handsome, with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We sat. Jake positioned me between him and Mark, and the conversation began. It was normal at first. They asked about my work, I asked about theirs. We talked about the city, about restaurants, about a recent scandal at a tech company that Mark had opinions about. I started to relax. The kind of men Jake would naturally be friends with. But about 20 minutes in, something shifted. So Jake's been keeping you hidden. Just busy, I said lightly. You know how it is. We do, Ryan said, and something in his tone made me glance at Jake. He was smiling, but his jaw was tight. Jake's told us plenty about you, though. All good things, I hope, I said, falling back on the social script. Very good things, Connor added. And there was a pause that lasted half a second too long. The conversation continued, but I became aware of an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. The men kept circling back to me, asking questions that felt normal individually but strange in accumulation. What did I do for fun? Did I travel for work? What was my workout routine? Each question was followed by glances at Jake, like they were checking something. At one point, Mark asked, Jake mentioned you ran a marathon last year. That's impressive. You must be pretty disciplined. I try to stay consistent, I said. I bet you are, Mark said, and again, that glance toward Jake. Consistency is important. I felt Jake's hand on my knee under the table, squeezing gently. When I looked at him, he was beaming at me with what I interpreted as pride. I smiled back, trying to shake off the strange feeling settling in my chest. Dinner arrived, and the conversation expanded to safer topics. Work stories, college memories that Jake had never told me before, plans for someone's upcoming birthday trip to Miami. I participated where I could, laughed at the appropriate moments, played the role of the attentive wife integrating into her husband's social circle. But I noticed things. The way Connor's eyes kept dropping to my neckline when he thought I wasn't looking. The way David asked Jake, directly, she's exactly like you described, as if I wasn't sitting right there. The way Ryan made a comment about my energy that felt loaded with meaning I couldn't decode. And I noticed Jake. He was performing. Every time I spoke, he watched his friends' reactions. When I made a joke that landed, he looked pleased. When Mark complimented my intelligence after I made a point about market trends, Jake nodded like he'd accomplished something. We left around 11. In the car, Jake was euphoric. That went so well, he kept saying. They loved you. Mark texted me that you were amazing. David said you were exactly what he'd hoped. What he'd hoped. You know, that you'd be cool. Easy to talk to. They can be particular about who they let into the group. It's not a club. Jake. They're your friends. Our friends now, he corrected, reaching over to squeeze my thigh. His hand stayed there for the drive home, higher than casual, possessive in a way that felt different than it had before. That night he wanted sex. He was more aggressive than usual, rougher. And he kept whispering things about how proud he was of me, how perfect I'd been, how they'd all been impressed. I thought he was just turned on by the successful evening. Now I know he was celebrating something else entirely. He was celebrating the first transaction. Over the next few weeks, the friend group became a regular fixture in our lives. Group dinners every other Saturday. Texts and group chats that Jake would show me selectively. Invitations to birthday parties, golf outings, couples events where I was often the only wife or girlfriend present. The other men were single or divorced, Jake explained. I was lucky to have gotten him to settle down. I started to notice patterns. The way they'd steer conversations toward my body under the guise of fitness talk. "You're looking fit. What's your secret?" The way they'd make jokes about Jake being lucky and him accepting the compliments like I was a prize he'd won. The way they'd ask increasingly personal questions. "Do you and Jake travel a lot? Just the two of you? Ever think about bringing friends?" I brought it up to Jake once, carefully after a dinner where Ryan had made a comment about my dress being dangerous. "Do you think your friends are a little, I don't know, inappropriate sometimes?" We were getting ready for bed, and Jake was scrolling through his phone. "What do you mean?" He didn't look up. "Just some of the comments. About how I look. It feels a little much. They're complimenting you, Sarah. They think you're attractive. I think it's nice that they appreciate you, but the way they say it, you're being sensitive." Now he looked at me, and his expression was patient, almost condescending. "They're good guys. They're successful, smart, they have high standards. The fact that they accept you is a good thing. Don't create problems where there aren't any." I dropped it. I told myself he was right, that I was being oversensitive, that I should be grateful to be included in this group of accomplished men. I told myself this what marriage looked like, what integration into your spouse's social circle required. I told myself a lot of lies during those months. But my body knew before my brain did. I started dreading the group dinners. I'd feel my stomach tighten when Jake would announce another gathering. I'd spend hours choosing outfits, trying to find something that was attractive enough to avoid Jake's disappointment, but not so attractive that it would invite commentary. It was an impossible balance, and through it all, Jake watched how I interacted with his friends, monitored my responses, corrected me later if I'd been too quiet or too talkative. "You could have engaged more with David," he'd say in the car ride home. "Or you were flirting a little with Mark. Be careful with that." I wasn't flirting. I was trying to survive the increasingly uncomfortable dynamic I'd found myself in. But Jake was rewriting reality, and I was starting to believe his version instead of trusting my own perceptions. That was his greatest skill. Not the manipulation itself, but making me doubt my ability to see the manipulation. 3 months into regular contact with the friend group, the dynamic escalated. It was subtle at first, the way all effective manipulation is. Small boundary violations that could be explained away. Jokes that cut a little deeper each time. Situations engineered to make me uncomfortable while maintaining plausible deniability. The shift started at Connor's birthday party. It was at his apartment. A sleek high-rise downtown with floor-to-minus ceiling windows and furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable. There were about 20 people there, but the core group, Jake's friends, dominated the space and the energy. I'd worn jeans and a black top, deliberately understated after Jake had made comments about me drawing too much attention at the last gathering. I was in the kitchen refilling my wine when David cornered me. Not physically, but he positioned himself between me and the exit in a way that forced me to engage. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm and slightly slurred. "Can I ask you something personal?" Every instinct told me to deflect, but I'd been trained by Jake to be accommodating. "Sure. How'd Jake convince you to marry him? I mean, look at you. You could have had anyone." "That's sweet," I said, trying to move past him. He shifted slightly, blocking me. "No, I'm serious. What's his secret? We've all been trying to figure it out." "Figure what out?" "How to get someone like you. Jake must have some trick. You should share it with the rest of us." He laughed, but his eyes were intense, waiting for my response. "There's no trick. We fell in love, right? But there's always something. Come on. Between us, What does he do that keeps you around? He must be really good at something. The implication was clear. I felt my face heat up, felt the familiar conflict between the trained politeness of being a woman in social situations and the anger rising in my chest. I should get back, I said, moving firmly around him. He let me go but calls after me. Think about it, Sarah. We're all curious. I found Jake in the living room, deep in conversation with Mark and Ryan. When I approached, their conversation stopped abruptly, and they all looked at me with identical expressions of anticipation. Everything okay? Jake asked. Fine. David was just. I trailed off, unsure how to articulate what had happened without sounding paranoid. David's a good guy, Jake said quickly. Sometimes he drinks too much and gets chatty. Don't take it personally. But Mark was watching me with interest. What did David say? Nothing. Sarah's being modest, Jake said, and put his arm around me, pulling me against his side. David's probably just doing what we all do, wondering how I got so lucky. Ryan laughed. That is the eternal question. She's remarkable. Isn't she? Jake continued, and his hand slid down to my hip. Beautiful, smart, successful, and patient. So patient. Patient? Mark asked. With me. With all my bullshit. Some women can't handle a guy who's ambitious, who has a demanding career and a close friend group. Sarah gets it. She's not jealous or needy. Adaptable. The word hung in the air. Adaptable. Like I was a tool, a resource that could be molded to fit whatever situation required. The men were all nodding, but I felt something dark unfold in my stomach. That's where, Connor said, appearing from somewhere behind us. Most women want to change you the second they get a ring, but you let Jake be himself. We let each other be ourselves, I said, and my voice sounded too defensive. Of course, Jake said soothingly. Sarah's not like other women. That's what makes her special. The conversation moved on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I'd been complimented, but it felt like objectification. I'd been praised, that it felt like I was being discussed rather than included. And Jake's hand stayed on my hip the entire time, tight enough that I couldn't casually move away without making a scene. Later that night, in bed, Jake was more animated than I'd seen him in months. Tonight was perfect, he said. Did you see how well you fit in? They all love you. Do they? Or do they love the idea of me? What does that mean? Some of the things they say, Jake, the way they talk about me, it feels objectifying. Jesus, Sarah, they're complimenting you. Is it so hard to just accept that people think you're attractive and interesting? It's not about accepting compliments. It's about the way they do it, like I'm not even there. Like I'm some kind of achievement you unlocked. Jake sat up, and his tone changed, became harder. You know what your problem is? You've been listening to too much feminist bullshit online. These are good men, successful men. They're showing you respect by including you, by treating you like one of us. And you're turning it into some kind of victimhood narrative. I'm not. You are. You're creating drama where there isn't any. I've known these guys for over a decade. They're my closest friends. If you can't handle being around them without getting offended, that's a you problem, not a them problem. The argument ended with me apologizing. He'd twisted it so effectively that I ended up comforting him, assuring him that I'd try harder to be less sensitive, that I appreciated being included, that I understood how important these friendships were to him. That was the pattern. Every time I pushed back, he'd reframe my discomfort as my failing. I was too sensitive. I was creating problems. I was being unfair to him and his friends. Steadily, I began to doubt my own perceptions. The incidents increased in frequency and intensity. At a group dinner the next month, Mark asked Jake, directly in front of me, "Do you two have an open relationship?" Jake laughed and said no. But Mark pressed, "So Sarah's just naturally cool with you having a life outside the marriage?" Again, phrasing that suggested my boundaries or lack thereof were the topic of group discussion. Ryan started texting me directly, nothing overtly inappropriate. Just friendly check-ins that felt like boundary testing. "Jake's lucky to have you. Hope you're having a good week. We should all grab drinks sometime." When I mentioned it to Jake, he encouraged it. "It's good that they feel comfortable with you. That means they trust you, trust us." At a golf outing that I wasn't invited to but heard about later, Connor apparently asked Jake if I had any single friends like her. When Jake told me this, he said it with pride, like Connor's interest in my social circle was validation of my worth. The most disturbing incident happened at a dinner 6 months into this nightmare, though I didn't understand its significance until much later. We were at a steakhouse, and the alcohol was flowing freely. The conversation turned to relationships, and David launched into a story about an ex-girlfriend who'd been too uptight about his friendships. "Some women just don't understand that men need freedom," David said. "They get insecure, try to control who you see, what you do. Sarah's not like that," Jake said, and squeezed my hand. "She gets it." "Gets what?" I asked. "That controlling your partner doesn't work. That trust means giving each other space." "I agree with that," I said carefully. "See?" Jake turned to the group. "She understands that a strong relationship means independence. And you give her the same freedom?" Mark asked, his tone suggesting this was a test. "Of course," Jake said. "If Sarah wanted to go out with her friends, have her own life, I'd support that completely." It sounded reasonable in the moment. But the way the men all nodded, the way they looked at each other with knowing expressions, suggested a subtext I wasn't privy to. Later, I'd understand they weren't talking about independence. They were talking about access. The breaking point of this phase came at a weekend trip to the lake. Connor's family had a house there, and we were all invited for a long weekend. I hesitated to go. Something about being in an isolated location with these men for 3 days triggered every warning bell in my body. But Jake was insistent. "This is important, Sarah. These trips are when we really bond. If you don't come, it'll send a message that you're not committed to being part of this group." "What group?" "They're your friends, Jake. Our friends, our circle. This is what adults do. They build communities with other successful couples. Do you want to be isolated? Just the two of us forever?" The way he framed it made my hesitation seem childish, unhealthy even. So I agreed. The lake house was beautiful and horrible. Beautiful because it was objectively stunning. All windows and modern architecture. Horrible because from the moment we arrived, I felt trapped. There were no other women. Just me and 5 men and 3 days of forced proximity. The first evening was tense. We made dinner together, drank expensive wine, sat on the deck overlooking the water. The men were in high spirits, telling stories from college that grew more raunchy as the night progressed. I laughed at the appropriate moments, trying to be a good sport. But then Ryan started a story about a girl from their university days. Someone named Jessica who apparently loved attention. "Remember how she used to dress?" Ryan said. "And how she'd pretend to be shocked when we noticed." "Some girls are like that," David added. "They want the attention but want to pretend they don't." I felt Jake tense beside me. The conversation had taken a turn, and I realized with creeping dread that they were testing something. Testing me. Testing Jake. Testing boundaries. "Not all women are like that," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Of course not, Mark said smoothly. You're definitely not like that, Sarah. Authentic, Conraded, comfortable with yourself, Ryan finished. They were complimenting me. But it felt like a trap. Every positive word felt like it was boxing me into a corner, defining me in ways that would later justify something I couldn't yet see. Jake's hand found my knee again, that now minus familiar possessive grip. Sarah knows who she is. That's what I love about her. She doesn't play games. The evening continued, but I'd stopped really listening. I was too busy trying to decode the subtext, the layers of meaning beneath the friendly surface. When we finally went to bed, Jake fell asleep immediately, but I lay awake in the unfamiliar room, listening to the men's voices drifting up from the deck below, their words indistinct but their laughter sharpened exclusionary. I should have left the next morning. I should have faked an emergency and demanded Jake drive me home. But I didn't. I stayed because leaving would have meant confronting something I wasn't ready to name. So I stayed, and I smiled, and I played the role I'd been assigned without fully understanding what that role was. That was the weekend I started to break. Not visibly. I was still performing normalcy. But internally, something fundamental shifted. I started watching instead of participating. I started cataloging instead of dismissing. I started documenting instead of forgetting. I started preparing for a war I didn't know I was already fighting. The truth announced itself on a random Tuesday afternoon in October. I wasn't looking for it. The universe simply decided I'd been deceived long enough and handed me the evidence I needed to understand the scope of Jake's betrayal. I'd come home early from work because a migraine had been building all day, the kind that makes light feel like violence. Jake wasn't home yet. I took medication, closed the bedroom curtains, and lay down in the darkness, phone on the nightstand, waiting for the pain to recede enough that I could function. That's when Jake's iPad, which he'd left on the bed that morning, lit up with a notification. We'd always had each other's passwords. It was one of those marriage transparency things that seemed like trust but that I'd later understand was his way of ensuring I never felt I had reason to check. If I could look anytime, I wouldn't bother looking. Genius, really. The notification was from a group chat. Not the one I occasionally saw messages from, the public one with harmless friend banter. This was labeled the Brotherhood. Even through my migraine fog, that name sent a chill through me. I picked up the iPad. I don't know what instinct guided my hand, what subconscious accumulation of wrong details finally hit critical mass. But I opened the chat, and I read. The first message I saw was from Mark. Sent just 10 minutes earlier. Is Sarah still cool with Miami? We're finalizing the boat rental. Ryan, she doesn't have a choice at this point, lol. Jake's got her trained well. Connor, that sounds darker than you probably meant it. Ryan, does it? Man set clear expectations from the start. That's leadership. My hands were shaking. I scrolled up, my migraine forgotten in the flood of adrenaline. What I found was a systematic, detailed, horrifying archive of my husband's betrayal. Messages from 3 years ago, before we were even engaged. Jake describing me to his friends in transactional terms. She's got a great job so she won't be financially dependent. Hot enough to make you jealous, smart enough to hold a conversation. And here's the best part, she's got low self-esteem disguised as confidence. That means she can be shaped. Mark's response: you're a genius, man. How'd you figure that out? Jake, you watch, you listen, you test boundaries. Sarah's got daddy issues she doesn't even recognize. Her parents divorced when she was young. She spent her whole childhood trying to be perfect enough to keep people from leaving. That means she'll tolerate a lot to maintain stability. She's the perfect long-term investment. I read that message 5 times before I could process it. He'd called me an investment. He'd identified my childhood trauma and seen it not as something to support me through, but as a vulnerability to exploit. The messages continued chronologically, documenting our entire relationship through a lens of calculation I'd never imagined. Jake describing our dates as relationship groundwork. Jake celebrating our engagement as securing the asset. Jake explaining to his friends that marriage to me would provide him with social capital and legitimacy while maintaining his freedom because I was trainable. Trainable. Like a dog. But the messages about the friend group were what destroyed me. Because they revealed everything I'd felt, but told myself I was imagining. 6 months into our marriage, Jake had sent a long message to the group. Okay, guys, time to execute phase 2. I'm bringing Sarah in. Here's the deals. He needs to see you as my peers, as alphas in your own right. That means I'm going to facilitate situations where she's slightly uncomfortable, but can't complain about it. Compliments that are a little too personal. Questions that are a little too intimate. I'll watch her reactions and correct any resistance privately. The goal is to normalize the dynamic so that when we move to the next phase, she's already conditioned to accept it. David, next phase being? Jake, you'll see. Patience. This is a long game. But trust me, in a year, Sarah will be the most accommodating wife in our circle, and you all will benefit from that. Mark this as either genius or psychotic. Jake, why not both? I scrolled further, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might vomit. I found messages from after the first dinner where Jake introduced me to them. Hunter. Dude, she's better than advertised. You weren't exaggerating. Jake. Told you. And she performed perfectly. Did you see how she handled David's questions? Uncomfortable but polite. Exactly what we want. Ryan, so what's the timeline here? Jake, why? Slow integration. I'll keep exposing her to boundary minus pushing situations. Each time, she'll adapt a little more. The trick is making her think any discomfort she feels is her being oversensitive. Already started that process tonight. By the time we get to Miami, she'll be exactly where we need her. Miami. They kept mentioning Miami. I searched the chat for that keyword and found dozens of references. A trip planned for next month. Some kind of weekend excursion. And the messages about it made my blood run cold. David, so we're all clear on the Miami arrangements. I don't want any confusion when we're there. Jake, crystal clear. Separate rooms for appearances. But Sarah will understand that the trip is for group bonding. I've been laying the groundwork for weeks. She knows how important you all are to me, how much I value the brotherhood. She'll be accommodating because that's who I've taught her to be. Mark, you're sure she won't freak out? Jake? Even if she's uncomfortable, she won't leave. That's the beauty of the foundation I've built. Sarah's entire identity is wrapped up in being the cool wife. The understanding partner, the woman who doesn't create drama. She'll do what's expected because the alternative is admitting she married someone who doesn't respect her, and her ego can't handle that truth. There was more. So much more. Messages about my body, clinical assessments of my physical attributes and how they benefited Jake's status. Messages about my personality, how my intelligence made me interesting enough to show off, but my insecurity made me manageable. Messages about our sex life that made me want to burn my own skin off. But the worst was a voice note. Jake had sent it after the lake house weekend, and I clicked on it with trembling hands. His voice came through tinny but clear. Gentlemen, I'm calling this weekend a complete success. Sarah's full integration is nearly complete. She spent 3 days in a house with 5 men, some of whom made deliberately provocative comments. And she didn't complain once. She's been fully conditioned to interpret any discomfort as her own inadequacy rather than inappropriate behavior. This is textbook psychological manipulation. And I'm telling you, it works. The key is consistency and reframing. Whenever she pushes back, you make her the problem. You question her perception, her sensitivity, her loyalty. She stops trusting herself and starts trusting you. Sarah's there now. She's ready for Miami. Who knows? We might have more options than we initially planned. The voice note ended. I sat in the dark bedroom. Jake's iPad in my hands, my entire reality shattered around me. I'd spent 2 years in a marriage I thought was built on love, only to discover I'd been a project, an experiment, a thing to be shaped and offered and used. The migraine was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp it hurt worse than any physical pain. I understood everything now. Every strange comment, every boundary violation, every time I'd felt crazy for feeling uncomfortable. It had all been engineered, deliberate, calculated. Jake had identified my vulnerabilities and systematically exploited them to turn me into something I didn't recognize. And his friends weren't innocent bystanders. They were collaborators. They'd known the whole time that I was being manipulated. Enjoyed it, and apparently were expecting some kind of payoff in Miami that I didn't want to fully imagine. I sat there for 3 hours, reading every message in that chat, listening to every voice note, screenshotting everything. By the time Jake came home at 6:30, I had a complete archive of his betrayal stored in 3 separate cloud accounts. I'd sent copies to any mail address he didn't know about. I'd printed the most damning messages and hidden them in my car. When I heard his key in the lock, I closed the iPad, put it back exactly where he'd left it, and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. That woman was done being manipulated. Jake called out a greeting. I took a breath, put on the mask I'd been wearing for 2 years, and went to meet him. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice normal. "How was your day?" "Long," he said, kissing my cheek. "Yours?" "Migraine." I took something and dressed it. "I'm better now." "Good," he said. And there was nothing in his face but casual concern. No guilt. No awareness that his entire scheme was about to collapse. "Want to order in?" "I'm too tired to cook." "Sure," I said. "Whatever you want." We ordered Thai food. We ate on the couch watching a show we'd been following. Jake told me about his day, complained about a difficult client, asked about my upcoming project deadlines. It was so normal, so mundane. The gap between the life I thought I had and the reality I'd just discovered was so vast it felt like falling. But I didn't fall. I stayed balanced on the knife's edge of my new awareness and began to plan. Because I'd learned something important in those 3 hours of reading my husband's systematic documentation of my psychological manipulation. He'd taught me how to deceive someone completely. He'd shown me how to identify weaknesses and exploit them. He'd demonstrated the power of patience and long-term strategy. Jake had trained me well, just not in the way he'd intended. Now I was going to use every lesson he'd taught me to destroy him. The hardest part wasn't the rage. Rage would have been simple, clean, almost a relief. The hardest part was continuing to play the role of oblivious wife while every cell in my body screamed to confront him, to hurt him, to make him feel a fraction of the betrayal that was currently dismantling my sense of reality. But confrontation would have been emotional, messy, and ultimately ineffective. Jake was too skilled at manipulation to be defeated by raw anger. If I accused him, he'd reframe it. If I cried, he'd comfort me while undermining my perceptions. If I left immediately, he'd control the narrative, tell his friends I'd been unstable, Spin the story so that I became the villain and he the victim of a crazy wife. No. If I was going to do this, I needed to be methodical. I needed to be patient. I needed to become exactly what he'd tried to make me, but for my own purposes. I needed to become a predator. That first night after discovering the truth, I lay next to Jake in bed and began drafting my strategy. Not on paper, I couldn't risk any physical evidence, but mentally, organizing the steps I'd need to take, the resources I'd need to gather, the timeline I'd need to follow. First, information. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. The group chat had revealed the psychological manipulation, but I needed to know if there were legal vulnerabilities, financial entanglements, or other people involved. I needed a complete map of Jake's life, his relationships, and his plans. Second, resources. I needed money he couldn't access, legal representation he didn't know about, and allies who were loyal to me, not to us as a couple. I needed to build a support structure that was entirely separate from the life Jake and I had constructed together. Third, documentation. I needed evidence of everything, not just for my own validation, but for the public exposure I was already planning. Screenshots, recordings, financial records, communications. I needed an archive so comprehensive that Jake couldn't deny, deflect, or rewrite what he'd done. Fourth, timing. I needed to wait for the perfect moment. The setting where maximum damage could be inflicted with maximum precision. And I already knew what that moment would be. Miami. The trip where Jake had planned to complete whatever sick final phase of his project he'd designed. That's where I'd detonate his entire life. But I had a month to prepare, and I needed to use every day of it. The next morning, I woke up before Jake and went to work early. Instead of going to the office, I drove to a coffee shop across town and called a lawyer. Not our family lawyer, the one who'd handled our will and estate planning. A divorce attorney named Margaret Chen who specialized in high-minus conflict separations and had a reputation for being ruthless. I need to understand my options, I told her in our initial consultation. But I can't file yet. Margaret was in her 50s, sharply dressed, with eyes that had clearly seen every variation of human betrayal. She didn't judge. Didn't try to talk me into or out of anything. She just listened as I explained the situation, then laid out a clear strategy. First, you need to protect yourself financially, she said. Do you have separate accounts? We have a joint checking and savings. Everything's shared. Open a new account at a different bank. One he has no access to, unknown knowledge of. Start moving money there. Small amounts that won't trigger suspicion. You need a cushion for when this goes public. How much? Minimum 3 months of living expenses. 6 is better. You'll need first and last month's rent for a new place, retainer fees for lawyers, and money for basic living while you transition. I nodded, taking notes on my phone. Second, document everything. You mentioned you have screenshots of messages. Good. But I need you to catalog every incident of emotional abuse, manipulation, or coercion. Dates, times, what was said, who was present. The more specific, the better. Is that admissible in divorce proceedings? Depends on the judge and how it's presented. But it's insurance. If he tries to paint you as unstable or make claims about your mental health, you need counter-minus evidence. And honestly, even if it's not used in court, it's protection against gaslighting. When someone's been manipulating you for years, having concrete evidence helps you trust your own reality. That struck me. Trust your own reality. I lost that so completely over the past 2 years. Having someone validate that Jake's behavior was abusive, that my perceptions were accurate, felt like oxygen after suffocation. Margaret and I met 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Each meeting added layers to my strategy. She connected me with a therapist who specialized in narcissistic abuse and manipulation. I need professional documentation of the psychological impact. She recommended a forensic accountant to review our shared finances and identify any hidden assets or liabilities I should know about. She outlined the divorce process, explained what would happen to our shared property, our apartment lease, even our dog. By the end of week 2, I had a complete escape plan. A separate bank account with $8,000. A therapist I was seeing twice a week. A storage unit where I'd moved sentimental items, important documents, and anything else I couldn't replace. A list of apartments I could move into on short notice, and a lawyer on retainer, ready to file paperwork the moment I gave her the signal. But I also had something else planned for Miami, because I wasn't just leaving Jake. I was destroying the entire sick structure he and his friends had built. I thought about simply not going to Miami, using the trip as an opportunity to move out while he was gone. But that felt incomplete. It let them off too easily. Jake and his brotherhood had spent years planning my degradation. They deserved to have their plans blow up in their faces. They deserved to be exposed, humiliated, held accountable in front of each other. They deserved exactly what they'd been planning to do to me. So I told Jake I was excited about Miami. I played the role of the eager wife, asking about the itinerary, suggesting activities, even shopping for new clothes for the trip. Jake was delighted. He thought his conditioning had worked perfectly, that I was enthusiastically embracing whatever he had planned. But while I was pretending to be excited, I was also preparing my trap. I contacted 3 people: my younger brother Marcus, who was an investigative journalist, my best friend from college, Tessa, who'd been concerned about my marriage for months, but I'd always dismissed her worries, and surprisingly, Mark's ex-wife, a woman named Caroline whom I'd found through social media and reached out to on a hunch. Caroline and I met for coffee one afternoon while Jake thought I was at work. She was beautiful, composed, and the moment I mentioned the Brotherhood, her face hardened. "They're a cult," she said flatly. "That's what Mark called it, the Brotherhood. A group of men who believe they're superior to everyone else, especially women, who think the rules don't apply to them because they're successful and smart." Did Mark? I couldn't finish the sentence. Did he manipulate me the way your husband is manipulating you? Yes. Did he try to share me with his friends? He wanted to. That's why I left. He started introducing this idea of openness in our relationship, but only openness that benefited him. He wanted me to be comfortable with his friends touching me, flirting with me, having access to me. He framed it as evolution, as being sex- positive and modern. But I knew what it really was. It was degradation disguised as liberation. What did you do? I divorced him and took him for everything I could. But I didn't expose him publicly. I should have. These men need to face consequences, real ones, public ones. Otherwise, they just move on to the next victim. Would you be willing to help me expose them? Caroline smiled. And it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this opportunity. "Tell me what you need." I told her about Miami, about my plan to record whatever Jake and his friends had planned, to document it and then release it in a way that couldn't be denied or minimized. Caroline offered to come to Miami separately, to be there as backup and witness. She also offered something else: testimony. If I was building a case against not just Jake but the entire group, her first-hand account of Mark's behavior would establish a pattern. Marcus, my brother, was equally supportive. "I've got recording equipment," he said. "Professional grade. The kind that picks up clear audio even in loud environments. And I know people who can help you if this goes viral." Fact-checkers editors. People who can make sure your story is told accurately if Jake tries to spin it. Tess's response was more emotional. She cried when I told her everything, apologized for not pushing harder when she'd sensed something was wrong, and immediately offered her apartment as a place to stay when I left Jake. You can stay as long as you need. Forever, if you want. I've got your back. These 3 people became my inner circle, the team helping me orchestrate Jake's destruction. And over the next 2 weeks, we refined the plan until it was flawless. I would go to Miami. I would let Jake and his friends proceed with whatever they'd planned. But I'd be wearing a recording device, with instructions to call the police if I went silent for more than 2 hours. The recordings would be transcribed, edited for clarity, and released simultaneously to the group's employers, their professional networks, their families, and if it was warranted, the public. I wasn't going to ruin Jake quietly. I was going to ruin him completely. But the hardest part of the month wasn't the planning. It was the performance. I had to continue being Sarah, Jake's wife, every single day. I had to smile when he touched me. I had to laugh at his jokes. I had to have sex with him while knowing exactly what he thought of me, how he described our intimate life to his friends, how every moment of vulnerability I'd shared with him had been cataloged and analyzed as data. There were moments I almost broke. One night, Jake was scrolling through his phone while I pretended to read, and he laughed at something. "The guys are excited about Miami," he said. "Connor's making jokes about the boat rental. It's going to be a great trip." I looked up at him. This man I'd loved. This man who'd systematically dismantled my sense of self for his own amusement. And I felt nothing but cold contempt. But I smiled. "I'm excited too." "I know you are," he said, and reached over to squeeze my hand. "You're such a good sport, Sarah. That's what I love about you. A good sport." Like being psychologically tortured was a game and I was winning by enduring it gracefully. I squeezed his hand back and thought, you have no idea what's coming. The days counted down. I went to work, came home, had dinner with Jake, attended one more group event where Mark asked how I was feeling about Miami, and I said great while imagining the look on his face when everything collapsed. I saw Margaret twice more to finalize the divorce paperwork. I moved more money into my separate account. I visited 3 apartments and chose one, signing a lease that would start the week after we returned from Miami. Jake noticed nothing. Why would he? His plan had worked perfectly. He'd molded me into exactly what he wanted. He was so confident in his manipulation that it never occurred to him I might be capable of deception myself. That was his fatal error. He'd underestimated me. He'd seen my kindness as weakness, my trust as stupidity, my love as a resource to exploit. And because he'd never respected me as an equal, he never saw me as a threat. The night before we left for Miami, I packed carefully. Clothes, toiletries, sunscreen, and hidden in the lining of my suitcase, Marcus's recording device, disguised as a phone charger but actually a sophisticated audio recorder with 40-8 hours of battery life. Jake watched me pack, making suggestions, excited for the trip. At one point he hugged me from behind and said, "This is going to be an important weekend for us, for our future." "I know," I said. And I wasn't lying. It would be important. Just not in the way he imagined. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the darkness, listening to Jake's breathing, thinking about everything that was about to happen. I felt fear, yes. I felt rage. But more than anything, I felt determined. Jake had spent 2 years teaching me that I couldn't trust my perceptions, that I was too sensitive, that my discomfort was my failing. He tried to break me down into something he could control and use. But I'd always been stronger than he realized, and now he was about to learn exactly how strong. Miami wasn't going to be the culmination of his manipulation. It was going to be the site of his complete and total destruction, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. Miami was everything Jake had promised and nothing I'd expected. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon to heat that felt like a physical presence in a rental house that screamed expensive excess. 5 bedrooms, a pool, direct beach access, and enough space that the 6 of us rattled around like dice in a cup. The other men had arrived earlier. When Jake and I walked in, they were already drinking on the back deck. Music playing, the carefully cultivated atmosphere of successful men on vacation. They greeted me with hugs that lasted too long and compliments that made my skin crawl. But I smiled and played along. "Sarah?" Connor said, approaching with arms wide. "Finally. The party can really start now." "Glad to be here," I said, letting him hug me while the recording device in my pocket captured every word. That first evening was almost normal. We made dinner together, drank wine, sat by the pool telling stories. But I felt the undercurrent, the anticipation. Who kept looking at me, and I realized they were waiting for something. Waiting for him to initiate whatever had been planned. It started small. Ryan's adjusting we played Ruth or Dare like we were teenagers. Everyone laughing at the idea, but then actually doing it. The questions and dares were innocuous at first, but each round pushed slightly further. David being dared to jump in the pool fully clothed. Mark being asked about his most embarrassing sexual experience. Connor being dared to do a shot while doing a handstand. Then it was my turn. Ryan spun an empty bottle, and when it pointed to me, the energy shifted. Everyone got quiet. "Truth or dare, Sarah?" Ryan asked. "Truth," I said, my heart hammering. Ryan glanced at Jake, who nodded slightly. "Okay, truth. Does Jake satisfy you in bed?" The question landed like a grenade. I felt my face flush, felt the calculated violation of the question. This was it. This was the beginning of whatever they'd planned. I could have refused to answer. I could have called them out. But I needed them to continue. Needed them to reveal the full scope of their intentions while I recorded everything. So I laughed, forced and uncomfortable, and said, "That's pretty personal." "That's the game," David said. "You picked truth." "He does," I said finally. "Just yes?" Connor pushed. "Come on, Sarah." Details. Jake was watching me with intensity, monitoring my reaction. This was a test. If I refused, I failed. If I complied, I passed, and they'd continue. "He's great," I said, keeping my voice light. "Attentive. Adventurous how?" And there it was. The conversation had turned explicitly sexual, and they were all focused on me, pushing for details about my intimate life with my husband while he sat there encouraging it. "That's enough," I said, trying to sound playful but firm. No, Ryan said. "You have to give us more than that. What's the most adventurous thing you two have done?" I looked at Jake, silently begging him to intervene, to protect me, even though I knew he wouldn't. He raised his eyebrows, that expression I'd learned meant I was supposed to comply. "We've experimented with some things," I said vaguely. "Like what?" "Role play. Different locations. Nothing crazy. Would you ever want to experiment more?" David asked. "Like with adding other people?" The room went silent. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the reveal of what they'd been building toward. I felt sick and triumphant at the same time. "I don't think so," I said carefully. "But you've thought about it?" Connor pressed. "Everyone thinks about fantasies," I deflected. Jake finally spoke. "Sarah's open-minded. That's one of the things I love about her. She doesn't judge, doesn't make assumptions. So she'd be cool with you having fantasies that involve other people? Ryan asked Jake directly, as if I wasn't sitting right there. We've talked about it, Jake said, which was a complete lie. Sarah understands that monogamy can mean different things to different couples. My hands were clenched so tight my nails cut into my palms. He was rewriting our relationship in real minus time, creating a narrative where I'd consented to things I'd never even known were being considered. That's evolved of you, Sarah, Mark said, turning back to me. A lot of women would be threatened by that kind of openness. I'm not a lot of women, I said, and let them interpret that however they wanted. The game continued, but the damage was done. They'd established that I was open-minded. That night, in our bedroom, Jake was ebullient. You did great, he said, kissing my neck. I could tell the guys were impressed. Impressed by what? By you. By how cool you are. How you didn't freak out at some of those questions. Those questions were really inappropriate, Jake. They were just having fun. Testing boundaries. That's what friends do, is it? I asked, genuinely curious how he'd justify this. Yes. It's how you build trust. You push a little, see how someone reacts. And if they're cool, you know you can be yourself around them. You pass the test, Sarah. They know now that you're really part of the group. Part of the group. Like I'd been initiated into something. Like being sexualized by my husband's friends was an achievement to be proud of. I wanted to scream. I smiled. They more than approve, Jake said, and his hand slid down my side. Connor told me you were the coolest wife he'd ever met. That's a huge compliment from him. We had sex. I disassociated through it, my mind floating somewhere above my body while Jake celebrated what he thought was his victory. Afterward, he fell asleep immediately, and I lay there in the darkness, listening to the ocean through the open window, thinking about the next 2 days. Friday was worse. We rented a boat, went out on the water, and the isolation made everything more intense. There was drinking, there was swimming, and there was a relentless campaign to break down any remaining boundaries I had. Connor convinced me to sit on his lap because there weren't enough seats on the boat, even though there clearly were. Ryan kept making comments about my bikini, how I looked, asking if Jake approved of me dressing that way. Mark took photos constantly, and I heard him later showing them to the other men, their voices low and appreciative. And Jake orchestrated all of it. He encouraged Connor to put sunscreen on my back. He laughed when David made a joke about me being wife material for all of them. He asked me directly if I was having fun, if I liked his friends, if I felt included. Yes, because what else could I say with 5 men on a boat in the middle of the ocean? I knew you would, Jake said. I told them you were special. That night, back at the house, things escalated. We were all drunk or pretending to be. Someone suggested we go swimming, and before I could object, everyone was in the pool, including me. The men were playful, splashing and dunking each other, but I felt hands on me constantly. Someone's hand on my waist, steadying me. Someone's hand on my shoulder, pushing me under the water playfully. Someone's hand on my hip, pulling me toward them. It was impossible to tell who was touching me when, and I realized that was intentional. Plausible deniability. If I objected, they could claim it was accidental, that we were all just playing around, that I was being oversensitive. But it wasn't accidental. It was coordinated. And when I looked at Jake, he was watching with an expression I'd never seen before. Excitement. Pride. That's when I understood the full scope of what he'd planned. He wanted to watch his friends touch me. He'd spent 2 years conditioning me to accept boundary violations, building up to this moment where he could offer me to them, and I'd be too confused to gaslit. Too afraid of being labeled difficult to refuse. I got out of the pool. I'm tired, I said. I'm going to bed. Already? Connor called. Let her rest, Jake said, and followed me inside. He closed the door and immediately started criticizing me. You embarrassed me out there. How? By leaving early. By being cold. The guys are trying to include you, and you're acting like they're threatening you. Jake, they were touching me. They were playing. You're making something innocent into something dirty because you can't handle affection from anyone but me. Sarah. That's insecurity. There it was. The gaslighting. Turning my accurate perception of violation into my personal failing. But I didn't argue. I gotten what I needed. Everything from the past 2 days was recorded. Every inappropriate comment, every touch, every moment where Jake facilitated or encouraged his friends to violate my boundaries. I had evidence, comprehensive and undeniable. Now I just needed to detonate it. Saturday was the final day, and I woke up with perfect clarity. Today was the day I destroyed them all. I spent the morning being cheerful, helpful, the perfect guest. I made breakfast, cleaned up, laughed at jokes. The men were hung over and subdued, and the atmosphere was almost normal except for the looks they kept giving me, like they were waiting for something. At noon, Jake announced we were going to have a special dinner that evening, just the 6 of us, at a restaurant he'd reserved. It's a celebration, he said, of friendship, of the brotherhood, of this incredible weekend. I smiled. Sounds perfect. We spent the afternoon at the beach. I swam, sunbathed, read a book. I was calm, almost serene. The men seemed confused by my good mood, like they'd expected me to be more damaged by the previous night's violations. But I was done being their victim. At 6, we returned to the house to get ready for dinner. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress that was elegant and unremarkable. I wanted to look good but not attract the kind of attention that would distract from what was about to happen. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance. Jake had secured a private room, which he announced proudly. I wanted us to be able to talk freely, he said. Of course he did. We sat, ordered drinks and appetizers, and for the first part of the meal, everything was normal. They talked about work, about sports, about upcoming vacations. I participated minimally, watching and waiting. Then, during the main course, Jake cleared his throat. I want to make a toast, he said, standing with his wine glass. Everyone else stood, including me, to the brotherhood. You guys are more than friends. You're my brothers, and I want to thank you for being part of this weekend, for welcoming Sarah into our circle, for understanding what I was trying to build here. The men raised their glasses. I did too, but my hand was steady. And Sarah, Jake continued, turning to me, thank you for being exactly who I knew you were, for being open, understanding, and brave enough to be part of something bigger than just a traditional marriage. You're extraordinary. They all drank. I sipped my wine and set down the glass. Actually, I said quietly, I'd like to say something too. Jake looked surprised but pleased. I stood. 5 men looked at me with varying expressions of curiosity and anticipation. They thought I was going to thank them. They thought I was going to acknowledge my place in their sick hierarchy. I want to thank you all, I began, for showing me exactly who you are, for documenting your intentions so thoroughly that there's no possible ambiguity, and for believing that I was stupid enough not to notice what you were doing. The expressions changed. Confusion, dawning alarm. Sarah, Jake said carefully, what are you talking about? I pulled out my phone. Not the recording device. That was still safely in my pocket capturing this moment. My actual phone, which had receipts of everything I needed to show them. I'm talking about the Brotherhood group chat, I said. The one where you spent 2 years detailing exactly how you were manipulating me. Where you called me an investment untrainable. Where you planned this entire weekend as some kind of final test to see if I'd accept being passed around among your friends. The silence was absolute. Jake's face had gone white. I'm talking about how you identified my childhood trauma and used it against me. How you systematically broke down my boundaries while convincing me I was being oversensitive. How you turned your friends into accomplices in my psychological torture and called it brotherhood. You went through my phone, Jake managed, and even now he was trying to make me the villain. I found your iPad. I corrected, and I read everything. Every message. Every voice note. Every disgusting detail of your plan to condition me into accepting whatever degradation you had planned for Miami. Mark stood up. This is a misunderstanding. Sit down, I said. My voice sharp. You don't get to gaslight me anymore. None of you do. I have recordings of this entire weekend. I have screenshots of your group chat going back to years. I have testimony from Caroline, Mark, about how you tried the same thing with her. And I have a lawyer, a divorce attorney, who's ready to file papers Monday morning. Connor looked like he might throw up. David was staring at the table. Ryan was frozen with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. But Jake's expression was transforming from shock to rage. You recorded us. Without consent? Actually, Florida is a 2- party consent state for recordings. I interrupted. Which is why I'm not in Florida. I'm in a 1- party consent state. And I've been recording since we arrived. Everything you've said, everything you've done, all captured legally under datum Sibley. That was a bluff. The recording might not be admissible in court. But it was absolutely usable for public exposure, and they didn't know enough about the law to challenge me. But here's what happens now, I continued. I'm leaving. Tonight. I have a car picking me up in 20 minutes. Jake, our apartment is empty. I've moved everything I care about out. Divorce papers will be served to you Monday morning. I'm asking for nothing but my freedom and my name back. Sarah, Jake started, reaching for me. I stepped back. Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me again. And here's the best part. Those recordings, those screenshots, I'm releasing them. Not publicly, not yet, but to your employers, to your professional networks, to every social circle you've carefully built. You wanted everyone to know how clever you were, how you'd successfully manipulated your wife? Congratulations. You can't do that, David said. That's defamation. It's not defamation if it's true. And I have evidence. Mountains of it. From multiple sources. Good luck suing me when you'll have to admit in court that everything I'm revealing is accurate. Mark's phone started buzzing. Then Connor's. Then Ryan's and David's. They pulled them out, faces paling as they read. What? Connor whispered. That's Caroline, I said. Mark's ex-wife. She's releasing her own story right now, to everyone you all know mutually. Corroborating everything I've said, adding her own experiences with the Brotherhood. By Monday morning, every person in your professional lives will know exactly who you are. Jake lunged for me, but I'd anticipated it. I moved toward the door where 2 security guards, arranged by Caroline, were already waiting. They stepped into the room, and Jake froze. I paid for their time tonight, I said. To make sure I can leave safely. Because I know you, Jake. I know that when your control is threatened, you lash out. But you don't control me anymore. You never will again. I looked at each of them one final time. You thought breaking me down would make me weak. But you just taught me how to fight. You wanted me to be adaptable. I adapted. I became exactly what I needed to be to survive you and destroy you. So thank you. Thank you for being so arrogant that you documented your own abuse. Thank you for believing I was too damaged to fight back. And thank you for giving me the motivation to make sure you face real consequences for what you've done. I walked out of that room, out of the restaurant, and into the waiting car. I looked back once and saw them all standing in the window, Jake's face twisted with rage, the others looking shell-minus shocked. I didn't feel triumph. Not yet. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, like I'd been fighting for so long that peace was unfamiliar. But I also felt free. The car took me to the airport. Caroline met me there, hugged me tight, and said, "You did it. You really did it. We did it." I corrected. That night, from a hotel near the airport, I watched as the story spread. Caroline and I had coordinated releases to multiple platforms simultaneously. The men's professional LinkedIn networks saw carefully curated summaries of their behavior. Their employers received detailed reports with evidence. By Sunday morning, the fallout had started. Ryan was put on administrative leave from his private equity firm. David's law partners released a statement saying they were investigating allegations of misconduct. Connor's consulting company issued a statement distancing themselves from him. Mark's startup investors called emergency meetings. And Jake? Jake's firm fired him, 40-8 hours after I walked out of that restaurant. He'd lost his job, most of his friends, and his reputation. His parents called me, confused and angry, but when I sent them the evidence, they went silent. I blocked Jake's number, changed my locks, filed a restraining order when he showed up at Tess's apartment trying to convince me to talk reasonably. The restraining order was granted when I showed the judge the recordings, the messages, the systematic evidence of psychological abuse. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. I asked for nothing but my freedom. I didn't want his money, didn't want to be tied to him through alimony or property disputes. I wanted a clean break, and I got it. The brotherhood dissolved. The men scattered, some trying to rebuild their lives and reputations, others moving to different cities entirely. None of them escaped unscathed. The internet has a long memory, and their names are permanently associated with manipulation, abuse, and misogyny. As for me, I moved into my new apartment, started therapy 3 times a week, and began the slow process of rebuilding my sense of self. It wasn't easy. There were days I couldn't get out of bed. Days I doubted everything about my judgment and my worth. Days I wished I'd never met Jake, never trusted him, never opened myself up to someone who saw vulnerability as opportunity. But there were also days when I felt strong, when I remembered that I'd outsmarted someone who'd spent 2 years trying to break me. When I talked to other women who'd experienced similar manipulation and realized I'd done what many of them had been too afraid to do. When I looked in the mirror and recognized myself again. Recovery isn't linear. 6 months after Miami, I still have nightmares. I still flinch when men I don't know compliment me. I still second-guess my perceptions sometimes, that learned habit of doubting myself taking years to unlearn. But I'm alive. I'm free. And I'm myself again. It's been 1 year since Miami. 1 year since I walked out of that restaurant and into a life I had to build from absolute rubble. I'm sitting in my apartment, the one I chose without Jake's input, decorated with furniture he never touched, filled with air that's never been poisoned by his presence. It's cheesy, but it makes me smile every morning. The past year has been the hardest of my life. Therapy helped me understand the depth of what Jake did, not just the manipulation I'd discovered, but the systematic way he'd undermined my reality from the moment we met. It has a name: coercive control. It's a form of domestic abuse that doesn't leave bruises but leaves scars just as deep. I had to relearn how to trust my own perceptions. How to recognize that when something feels wrong, it probably is. How to understand that boundaries aren't signs of weakness but expressions of self-respect. How to accept that what happened to me wasn't my fault, wasn't caused by any inadequacy in me, but was the deliberate choice of someone who saw me as an object to manipulate rather than a person to love. The professional fallout for Jake and his friends was significant but not complete. That's the hard truth about justice, it's messy and incomplete. Ryan eventually got another job, though at a less prestigious firm. David left his practice but started working for a different company. Mark's startup survived. Connor moved to Los Angeles. Jake went to ground for a while, but eventually resurfaced with a new job in a different city. A carefully crafted public narrative about learning and growth. And probably, somewhere, a new victim he's identifying and studying and planning to break down. That reality haunted me for months. That consequences had been temporary, that somewhere another woman might be experiencing what I survived. But my therapist helped me understand something important. I didn't fail by not destroying him completely. I succeeded by escaping and by creating a record that would follow him. That would warn anyone who thought to look, that would make his next manipulation harder. I also learned I wasn't alone. After the story went public, dozens of women contacted me. Women who'd experienced similar manipulation. Women who'd been gaslit by partners, psychologically abused, systematically broken down and then blamed for breaking. Women who saw their own stories in mine and found the courage to leave their own toxic situations. I talk to some of them regularly now. We've formed an informal support network, helping each other navigate the aftermath of abuse. Celebrating victories like I trusted my gut today instead of guessing myself, and I went on a first date and didn't apologize for existing. Small victories that feel revolutionary when you've spent years having your reality denied. Caroline became a real friend. She's working on a book about coercive control and psychological abuse, using her own story and mine and those of other women who've reached out. She asked my permission to include details of my experience, and I agreed. If our pain can help someone else escape or prevent someone from entering a similar situation, then it means something. As for romantic relationships, I'm not there yet. The idea of trusting someone enough to be vulnerable again feels impossible right now. I've been on a few dates, mostly to prove to myself that I can, but I end them early with polite excuses. My therapist says that's normal, that rebuilding the capacity for intimacy after betrayal takes time, that I shouldn't rush it, but I have hope. That's what this year has given me, hope. Hope that I can heal. Hope that not all men are predators disguised as partners. Hope that my ability to love wasn't destroyed, just damaged, and damage can be repaired. I've also started speaking publicly about my experience. Nothing major, just local women's groups, college classes on healthy relationships, advocacy organizations that work on domestic abuse issues. It's terrifying every time. I shake before I speak. My voice sometimes breaks when I describe certain details. But people listen. And afterward, women come up to me and say, "Thank you for making me feel less alone," or "You helped me recognize what's happening to me," or "I needed to hear that it's possible to leave." Those conversations make everything worth it. Every nightmare, every panic attack, every moment of doubt about whether exposing Jake was the right choice. All of it justified by the possibility that my pain can prevent someone else's. I've also reconnected with parts of myself I'd lost. I started running again, not to maintain the body Jake approved of, but because I like how it feels to be strong. I took up painting, something I loved in college but abandoned because Jake said it was frivolous. I travel alone, choosing destinations based solely on what interests me. I eat meals without worrying if my food choices will prompt commentary. I wear what I want. I exist without editing myself for anyone's comfort. These sound like small things, but they're revolutionary. They're the evidence that I survived, that I'm rebuilding, that I'm becoming someone I recognize and respect. Last week, I ran into David at a coffee shop. He saw me first, and I watched him debate whether to approach. Eventually he did, his expression careful and almost apologetic. "Sarah," he said, "how are you?" "I'm good," I said. And I meant it. I've wanted to reach out, to apologize. Everything. I looked at him for a long moment. He did look sorry. But I also knew that sorry doesn't undo damage, doesn't erase trauma, doesn't constitute actual accountability. "David, if you're really sorry, here's what you do. You don't apologize to me. You examine your own behavior, your own beliefs about women, your own willingness to participate in abuse because it benefited you. You become someone different. You warn other men when you see them heading down similar paths. You do the work of not being who you were." He nodded slowly. "I know I am," I said. "I learned to trust myself again." "You should try it sometime." I walked out without waiting for his response. That conversation, that ability to speak my truth without apology or doubt, was evidence of how far I'd come. Today, I'm preparing for a date. A real one, with a man I met through friends who knows my story and hasn't run away. I'm nervous, obviously, but I'm also curious, hopeful, willing to try. Before I leave, I look at myself in the mirror. I see someone who survived something that was designed to break her. I see someone who fought back and won, even though the victory was messy and incomplete. I see someone who's still healing, but who's also living, growing, becoming. I see myself. Not Jake's version of me, not the distorted reflection that his manipulation created, but the actual me. Flawed, damaged, strong, brave. Complicated, real. And that woman, she's pretty incredible. To anyone reading this who's experienced something similar, you're not crazy. Your perceptions are accurate. What's happening to you is real, even if they tell you it's not. And you can leave. It will be hard, maybe the hardest thing you'll ever do. But you can do it. You can survive. You can rebuild. You can become yourself again. I'm proof. We all are, all of us who escaped and survived and refused to let their manipulation define our entire story. The life on the other side of abuse is hard minus one and precious and absolutely, completely worth fighting for. I promise you that. And to Jake, if you're reading this, you failed. You tried to break me, to turn me into something you could control and use and discard. But I'm still here. Stronger, wiser, freer than I was when I loved you. You don't occupy my thoughts anymore except as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what to avoid, a lesson in recognizing manipulation. You taught me how to fight, just not the way you intended. I take one last look at my reflection, grab my keys, and head out into the evening. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It's beautiful. I'm alive to see it. That's absolutely everything.